Hello, we are Team 21, and this is our IE 343 PV case study. In this study, we ask a simple but important question for a typical homeowner. Does it actually pay off to install rooftop solar panels? We focus on three representative single-family homes located in different locations and economic situations. In each case, we compare a grid-only baseline to a rooftop installation alternative over a 20-year study period using a 10% MARR, which we interpret as the homeowner's required return. We will walk you through our assumptions, modeling approach, and results to see when the PV is economically justified and when it is not. Now looking at our problem background. The central problem is to decide whether long-term savings justifies the large upfront cost of installing a residential PV system. In regions with different solar availability, electricity prices, and policy environments, that answers can change dramatically. In our IE 343 case study, we evaluate the economic feasibility of rooftop PV installation for a single home in each of the three cities, West Lafayette, Seattle, and Roswell. For each home, we compare two alternatives, continuing grid-only energy prices or installing the PV system. Next, we have a slide showing the Roswell, New Mexico property. When choosing our specific homes, we noticed that this house in Roswell, New Mexico already had solar panels, which is the reason we chose this for our project. This gave us a hypothesis that the PV systems were economically justified and provided a good representative house for Roswell.
To keep the analysis traceable and comparable across locations, we adopt a consistent set of economic assumptions. We evaluate all alternatives over a 20-year analysis period, expressed in real dollars, so general inflation is stripped out and we focus on real purchasing power. We use a 10% MARR as the homeowner's required return, representing their opportunity cost of capital, and loosely benchmarked to historical S&P 500 returns. When we use electricity price escalation, those rates represent real increases above inflation, not nominal growth. We also assign a salvage value at the end of the year 20. Yearly energy consumption is assumed to be consistent during the 20-year period. To find the increase in energy costs, we use a linear regression model based on the past 20 years. Our O&M is adjusted 2.25% every year as well for inflation. These assumptions allow direct comparison across the three cities while maintaining a realistic economic viewpoint from the homeowner's perspective. On the technical side, we standardize the PV system design and load behavior. For each city, we select a specific single-family home and size the PV system based on its available roof area and typical residential system sizing. We assume a fixed tilt roof-mounted grid-connected system. Annual PV energy production for each home comes directly from Google Project Sunroof. To capture performance decline over time, we apply a 0.5% per year degradation rate, consistent with NREL research on PV degradation rates. We also assume that each home's annual electricity consumption in kilowatts per hour remains constant in real terms over the 20-year period. Under this assumption, all changes in the homeowner's electricity bill are driven by PV production and the real electricity price path, not by changing occupancy, appliance efficiency, or behavior. While this is a strong simplification, it makes the three cities directly comparable and keeps the scope of the project manageable.
Applying the incremental present worth method shows clear differences in economic feasibility across the three cities for 2025 installation, evaluated over a 20-year economic period at a 10% MARR. In Seattle, the incremental present worth is approximately -8,000, clearly indicating that rooftop PV is not economically justified. In West Lafayette, it comes out to around -6,000, again implying that the PV system installation does not meet the required return. In Roswell, it comes out to around -800, meaning that Roswell is the closest to break even, but still not economically justifiable under our base case assumptions. These results reflect underlying regional differences. Seattle faces relatively high retail prices, but very weak solar resources, so the system generates limited annual kilowatt hours, making it difficult to recover the upfront costs in operation and maintenance. West Lafayette enjoys much better solar conditions than Seattle, but its local electricity prices are lower, so each kilowatt hour of PV output displaces cheaper grid energy, limiting the dollar value of savings. Roswell benefits from strong insulation and better PV production, which reduces our reliance on grid energy and makes the project perform best relative to the other cities. However, Roswell's electricity prices are still low enough that even with high output, savings are not large enough to overcome the installation costs, degradation-adjusted losses, and operation and maintenance when discounted at 10%, so that incremental present worth remains slightly negative in this city. Looking at the cash flow charts, both cities have the same shape. A big negative spike in 2025 for installation, a smaller annual operating cash flow, and a positive salvage spike in 2045. The difference is magnitude. Seattle upfront cost is larger, and the yearly bars stay much more negative, which shows a weak solar production rate, which limits annual savings. So PV never really recovers the initial cost at a 10% discounted rate. Roswell has smaller initial costs and annual bars much closer to zero, but it performs better because higher insulation boosts kilowatt hours in savings. But the annual net worth is still slightly negative most years, even with the salvage, so the overall present worth remains slightly below zero. At a 10% MAR, our recommendations are driven less by whether or not PV works or if it doesn't, and more by local economic conditions and geography. Seattle is a fundamentally resource-limited case, where persistent cloud cover and weaker insulation suppress the annual kilowatt-hour production. So even with relatively high electricity prices for the grid-only case, the project struggles to generate enough discounted savings to justify the inflated upfront initial cost. West Lafayette is more of a value-limited case. Solar potential is decent, but retail electricity is cheaper, so each kilowatt hour generated by the PV system displaces less expensive grid energy. And with the higher insulation costs, the economics get squeezed from both sides. Roswell is the closest to viable because of its strong solar resource, where production is high, and as such, the project is inherently more resilient to degradation. But under our base case assumptions, it still lands just short of our 10% MARR, meaning that it is the most sensitive to favorable shifts like lower installed cost, higher than forecasted PV system rates, or stronger end of life value recovery. Finally, it's important to acknowledge some limitations of this study. A 10% MAR is an aggressive household hurdle rate for an energy savings project. And at a 5% MAR, our Roswell recommendation flips to a strong recommendation for the installation of PV panels. And overall, PV feasibility is a highly assumption and location dependent matter, and it should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis with more specific household energy consumption rates, roof constraints, and refined resale and salvage estimates.
Because many of our inputs are uncertain or variable in the real world, we perform sensitivity analyses on three critical dimensions, starting with sunlight availability and price changes. For sunlight, we adjust PV energy production up and down relative to the base case estimates. In Roswell, if average PV production increases by 6% from our observed values, the incremental PW turns positive and PW raises to $146. This demonstrates that Roswell's negative result is highly sensitive to modest changes in weather or shading. In Seattle and West Lafayette, even a 20% increase in PV output does not produce a positive incremental PW. Both remain economically unfavorable under realistic improvements in sunlight conditions. For price changes, we look at simultaneous shifts in installation costs, O&M costs, and electricity prices. In Roswell, a 3% decrease in these prices is enough to reverse the decision and render PV attractive. In Seattle and West Lafayette, however, even a 15% reduction in prices wasn't enough to produce a meaningful change in our recommendation. PW values in Seattle and West Lafayette were still about -4,000 and -3,500 respectively. These findings show that Roswell's installation recommendation is fragile, while Seattle and West Lafayette cannot be adjusted by price changes or sunlight changes alone. We also examine the impact of home value increases from PV installation, since many homeowners care about property value as well as utility bills. We consider a scenario where the homeowner sells the house right at the end of our 20-year study period and captures the market premium associated with having rooftop solar. Based on recent solar reviews and Zillow research, we use a national 6.9% average in home value increase due to solar, with a slightly higher data-backed premium of about 7.2% in Seattle. In Roswell, applying a 6.9 increase to a home worth roughly $190,000 raises the incremental PW to just over $1,100, reversing our decision. In Seattle, where home prices and the percentage premium are higher, the incremental PW increases to approximately $14,000, which fully reverses the base case recommendation and supports installation. In West Lafayette, too, adding a 6.9% property value increase raises the incremental PW to about $8,000, again flipping the recommendation in favor of PV. These property value effects demonstrate that the economic decision can change significantly when we broaden the benefit stream beyond bill savings to include housing market outcomes, particularly in higher price markets.
Thank you for listening to our presentation. Our sources and our data is cited in our Excel and our report, as well as an explanation of our assumptions, our calculations, and our methodology. Thank you.